The rock music was so loud, I had to put my hands over my ears to try and block out the noise. Everyone around me was dancing and swaying like crazy, and Emily had joined them. She looked so weird. Emily was your typical nice girl who'd never been into rock music before. I don't know what happened that made her want to come to this party. I shouldn't have joined her and come along. I felt afraid. I wanted to call my dad to come pick me up, but he wouldn't be able to hear me in the middle of all that noise. I tried texting him, but there was no signal. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of torture chamber. I told Emily I wanted to move away from the dance floor, but I don't think she heard me. She was flipping her hair and rolling her eyes. She looked like a ghost. Her pupils disappeared, and it was as if there was only white in her eyes. What on earth was she doing? I moved away from everyone and sat in the quietest place I could find. But it wasn't exactly ideal because people from the party were using that corner to pee in. The smell was horrible. I couldn't take it. It felt like my stomach was being ripped to shreds. Suddenly, I puked. I was so embarrassed, and I was sure the people behind me had seen me. I was hesitant to turn around, but when I did, I couldn't believe it. No one even cared about what I'd done. There was even a couple making out. How disgusting. I walked a few steps away from that corner, only to see a tall, handsome guy making his way towards me. He said, "Had a bit too much to drink, eh?" I replied in a serious manner, "No, I don't even drink. Everything about this party makes me feel sick. I feel like I ate a whole nest of worms and they're crawling around inside me." He laughed so hard, then he took my hand and pulled me away from the crowd. I was so relieved when we arrived on the street. Finally, I was out of that torture chamber. I thanked him without even asking for his name, then called my dad. After half an hour, my old man arrived. During the half an hour that I waited alone on the street, a group of boys who looked like they belonged in a gang or something passed by. I was terrified. My heart was beating so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest like a bird in a cuckoo clock. I tried to ignore them and focus my gaze forward, but something strange happened. I heard them yelling, "Run, he's here!" I looked around, but there was no one except for the nice guy who'd helped me leave the party. He must have been keeping an eye out for me to make sure I was safe. My dad arrived, and when I turned to thank him, he'd vanished. The next day at school, Emily was avoiding me. I knew right away that she was annoyed I ditched her the night before. I'm an idiot. How had I forgot to tell her? But that wasn't the only thing bothering me. Emily didn't quite look like herself. She was wearing all black and she had fake tattoos. She wore eyeliner that covered her entire eyelids. She actually looked really scary. This wasn't what Emily was usually like. Normally she dressed like me and the other girls. I went back home without even getting the chance to speak to her. I took out my phone to call her, and that's when I received a text saying, "If anyone asks, I slept over at your place last night." Emily hadn't made it back home, and it was all because of me. I felt my heartache. The poor girl must have spent the whole night in that awful place. I replied, "It's okay, but are you all right?" She didn't respond. That was the last text I ever got from Emily. After that day, she acted completely different. She was mean to everyone and always chose to sit alone. She even stopped going to cheerleader practice. She was going downhill at a rapid pace, and what made it worse was that there was nothing I could do. One day I was helping my dad out at our pizza shop. One of the employees was sick, so I was covering for him. While I was out on the delivery bike, I spotted the guy I'd met at the party. Finally, I had a chance to properly thank him, I thought to myself. I pulled up next to him and told him that I was happy to see him and that I was thankful for his kindness. He smiled and told me he had been thinking about me ever since and that he'd been trying to find out my name or address, but to no avail. But then he invited me to hang out with him sometime. We exchanged numbers and then we went our separate ways. His name was Edward, and I was suddenly feeling very excited. That evening, I was receiving pizza orders on the phone when someone called and ordered a pizza, but in a really weird, scary way. At first, all I heard was a small sound. I said, "Pizza Amigos, how can I help you?" But I didn't hear any answer. The beeping sound continued to get louder, so I repeated myself, but this time they hung up. The phone rang once again, and I answered. A creepy voice said, "I want to order a big pizza with pepperoni in your blood." I shook it off and told myself that was probably just one of those stupid prank calls. I went home on my bike without thinking about the phone call. Behind me, a car was driving very slow. I thought I was in its way, so I moved to the side, but it didn't drive past me. Every turn I took, it followed me. The whole thing was terrifying. I didn't dare look behind me. I tried pedaling faster, but I couldn't escape the car. Because it was so dark, I bumped into something on the road and fell onto the ground. The street was completely empty and I hurt my leg badly. My shoulder was also bleeding. The car stopped and 2 people came out. I couldn't believe my eyes. One of them was Emily. I raised my hand towards her and said, "Emily, help me," but all she did was increase my panic. She got close to me and started pushing the wound until it bled even more. The whole time she had this creepy, manic smile on her face. I couldn't see the guy standing behind her because he was too far back. I tried screaming and pushing her away, but no voice came out. Fear and pain had frozen me on the spot. She took a piece of cloth and squeezed the blood out of my shoulder. Then she left me all alone in the middle of the street. I don't remember anything else except opening my eyes and finding myself in the hospital. My dad told me that I had to get stitches on my shoulder and that I could leave the hospital in a few hours. My dad left me alone to rest. Then my phone rang. It was Edward. A small smile grew on my face. Without even saying hello, he said, "Are you alone in the room?" "Yes," I answered. He hung up and opened the door to the room I was in. Then he closed it behind him. He got close to me and asked if I was okay, so I answered that I was fine, but what he said after that made my blood turn cold. He got close to me and held my wound until I cried from pain. He held his hand over my mouth so I wouldn't scream and whispered in my ear, "If you ever tell anybody about what happened yesterday, I will never leave you alone, and I will make sure that the rest of your life is miserable." Then he just left the room without looking back. Why was he acting that way? What did he have to do with what happened? What was his relationship to Emily? Was he? No, that wasn't possible. Edward protected me that night at the party. He couldn't be the one who was with Emily last night. But how else could I explain his threat? I went back home and I found it really hard to sleep. I tried calling Emily a few times, but she never ever picked up. But at that point, I was desperate for answers, so I waited until my dad had fallen asleep, and then I snuck out of the house. I wasn't able to ride my bike, so I called a taxi. The driver drove me to Emily's house, and I asked him to wait for me. When I knocked on the door, her mom opened. In a cold tone, I asked her, "Where's Emily?" She said that she thought she was sleeping at my place because we had a test tomorrow. I didn't know what to say next. I couldn't do anything but head back to the taxi, completely ignoring her mom's questions. The next day, I was so afraid that I asked my dad if I could go to work with him. He refused to take me and insisted that I stay home and rest. So I stayed at home alone. The day was long and boring, until it turned into a nightmare. As the sun was beginning to set, I heard a rattling sound on the window. I looked, and what I saw almost gave me a heart attack. Edward was standing outside with a creepy smile plastered across his face. I grabbed my phone quickly so I could call the cops. He yelled loudly, "If you don't put that phone down, I'm going to smash this window and come in and kill you. You better open the door for us." Us? Who was us? I started looking through all the windows like a lunatic, only to find Emily standing behind another one. I froze in my place. I tried thinking fast, but at the same time, I didn't want them to break the window and hurt me. What did they want from me? I looked back at Edward, but I couldn't find him. A mere few seconds later, I heard a banging on the door. I felt like it was going to break, so I yelled, okay, I'll open it." Oh, how I wish I hadn't. When I opened the door, Edward and Emily entered and closed the door behind them. Emily started putting candles all over the room and turned off all the lights. Edward stood next to me and told me that everything was going to be okay. I couldn't understand what was happening. Why me? What did they want from me? After a few minutes, they sat me down on a chair in the middle of the room. Edward wore a long cloak and hid his face with a hoodie. I wished with all my heart for my dad to return and rescue me, but he was still at work. Emily started muttering some words and walking around me as if she was doing some sort of prayer, but it wasn't the kind of prayer I'd ever heard at church before. It was something terrifying that I couldn't explain. Suddenly, the whole place turned eerily quiet. I saw Emily carrying something sharp and coming towards me. I started screaming hysterically, hoping that one of my neighbors might hear me. I stood up, but due to the darkness, I didn't know where to go. After a few seconds, I heard someone coming into the house and turning on the lights. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was my dad with the police. But how? The police took Edward and Emily, and my dad ran towards me to make sure I was okay. My shoulder was bleeding. It must have been because of the adrenaline passing through my veins. He took me to the hospital, and on our way, I asked him, "How did you know?" He replied, "I didn't." Emily's mom called me worried sick and told me that Emily hadn't been home for the last 4 days, and then she told me about your weird visit last night. So I told her that we were going to call the cops and for her to meet me at our house. When we arrived, we heard your screams and saw the house was in complete darkness. Later, I learned that Emily was involved with people who do devil worshipping, and that in order for her to become one of them, she had to collect 7 cups of blood. The blood she'd taken from me was probably not enough, so she had to come back to take more. That explained the sharp object she was carrying. As for Edward, he was a complete lunatic. He convinced people that he could give them supernatural powers if they completed the ritual. To tell you the truth, to this day, I still can't shake off the fear I felt that day. As for Emily, I don't know what happened to her, or the 6 other people she attacked before me. I only know that she didn't kill anyone, but she did hurt a lot of people. Did you like my story? Please share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more.